Have you ever been to a counselor before? As you interact with him or her, have you ever wondered what it feels like for him or her to counsel you? Does he or she get affected emotionally by what you say? What goes on in their minds as you share with them your struggles, thoughts, and feelings? I'm sure the curious mind of a teenager may have entertained these questions before. In my talk today, I hope to share what this journey of being a counselor had been like for me and what are some of my pickings along the way. I started on this journey about 20 years ago. Yes, it had been that long. I had spoken to lots of teenagers, children, and their families and caregivers. I've also had the chance to speak to educators, mental health professionals, doctors, and law enforcers, and even stood in a court of law once. The beginning was not easy, and there were times when I questioned my choice to be a youth counselor. But as the years go by, I get more and more convicted that this is what I'm cut out to do. If I were to live my life again, I say with certainty that being a youth counselor is what I definitely will want to do and be. I found that the conversation may not always be focused on my student. Sometimes my students give comments or ask questions about me instead in the counseling seat, as though our roles are reversed. These 3 comments on the slide are 3 most common things I get from my students, which I hope to give you my heartfelt response today. So you can have a read through these 3 comments before I turn to the next slide. I have grouped my pickings into 4 insights, and within these insights, I will also address the comments and questions you had just seen in the previous slide. So let's hit the road. 1, we are on the same journey of finding ourselves. I'm not very dissimilar with my students, other than my age and having walked more ground than them. I too am on this journey of finding myself. Hence, I cannot say I have fully mastered life to the point where I know all answers to all issues. It is interesting to me whenever a student tells me, "Ma'am, I'm here for answers. Please don't throw my question back at me. Just tell me what to do and I'll go and do it." I mean, seriously, that's not how counseling works. You see, I believe my students know themselves or have the potential to know themselves better than me. My job is to help my students know themselves better and heal themselves, and not for me to heal them. When the solution comes from within ourselves, that is what will stick with us for life. If I were to go and dispense advice readily to you without you thinking through for yourself what suits you best and how you can resolve your own issues, that solution would never be yours to own. Sometime down the road, you will likely come back to me with the same issue, or worse, say that counseling was not helpful and give up seeing a counselor forever. In helping my students find themselves, they every so often help me to find myself in return. Oftentimes, the suggestions that I gave them in session were suggestions that I could use in my own life. Example, things like reducing the commitments I have and focusing on what was important was something I remembered I could do with at that time when I said this to a student. There was another session I recalled. This one student who, at the end of his session, suddenly asked me if he could pray for me, that he wanted to seek God's blessing for me. He caught me off guard and I was stunned. All I could do was blink at him, waiting for him to explain more. My thoughts raced. Why does he want to pray for me? This is not right. It should not be him praying for me. Oh no, the power balance is reversed now. What should I do? He probably caught onto my stunned look and reassuringly told me that he wanted to pray for me because he felt that my job was so tough and I was always helping others and listening to people's problems. I was so touched by his sincerity and thoughtfulness. He was the one going through rough times then, and yet he selflessly thought of me. I graciously accepted his offer and allowed him to pray for me. That day, he did not just leave a prayer of blessing with me. He taught me to look beyond myself, not to be fixated on my struggles, but to appreciate the people around me, to always be ready to say a prayer of blessing for others. Till this day, he remains the only student who has ever offered to pray for me. 2. In order to really see you, I must dig deep within myself. It's easy to treat symptoms. Most people do that, especially when we are short of time and we're trying to get quick results. But the symptoms will only resurface again quickly, perhaps even viciously, in another setting, another time. When I first started this work, I was given a very challenging group of boys to counsel. The first 30 minutes of my counseling session with each of them would entail me running around the school looking for them as they played hide and seek with me. They were rude, challenging of my authority, uncooperative, doing all things to test my patience. I actually felt bullied and manipulated by this group of 14-year-olds. I began to feel upset about having to counsel them, as I felt I was not making any progress with their behaviors and thoughts. Some parts of me was starting to write them off as ne'er-do-wells. However, something in me persisted. I pushed on, trying to think of ways to reach out to them, to connect with them better. I turned up at every session, chasing them around the school till I got them for the remaining 30 minutes to sit in my counseling room to talk, to engage with me. Slowly and surely, I noticed them softening towards me. We began to share inside jokes, and I learned to laugh at myself as they made fun of me. When I started not to take myself so seriously around them, they also eased up in their attitude towards me, and they started showing me respect, surprisingly. My counseling relationship with them lasted 2 years. Many years later, I spotted one of these boys in a hair salon. A young man already, he was a hairstylist. What I saw, I hoped, was a young man who has made good choices in his life. Sure, some of my students may say that I am paid to do this work, so it is my job to not give up on them, to persist. Well, while my time and expertise are paid for, my heart is free. It is my heart that keeps me responding to my students and reaching out to them beyond my paid hours. I've learned that I need to reach deep into myself in order to connect with my students and not just treat the symptoms. The symptoms are the protective layers my students put on themselves to keep themselves from being hurt. Deep within each of us is a vulnerable, lovable, and good person. Getting in touch with my own vulnerability often brings me close to the vulnerability of my students. Just a few years ago, I was sitting across the table in a parent-teachers meeting from one of my students. She was someone who was highly uncommunicative with me, highly guarded, and not letting me into her inner world. While the parents and teachers were talking about her poor results and attendance, she was looking sullen and disengaged. Whenever her parents asked her for her thoughts, she would look away. As I observed her behavior, I wondered what she was feeling, listening to the adults talking about her and making decisions about her future without her inputs. My mind was racing for ways to reach out to her. To my surprise, then and there, she sent me a text saying, "I want to die right now." Those words hung heavy on my heart as I looked across the table at her. Her face gave nothing away about her death thought. She kept her expression nonchalant, non-committal. As the parents and teachers wrapped up the meeting, I asked for some time alone with her. As the parents closed the door softly behind them, I said quietly, "You really feel like dying." And then the tears came. Big, fat tears dropped from her eyes. Something in me connected with how she felt, and she opened up to me that day. Third, I'm an imperfect person. Though I'm a counselor, I don't have it right all the time. I'm also a human being, fully sentient, with a full range of emotions and limited thinking capabilities as you. Therefore, like you, I do get tired and worn out, especially after a long day of listening and attending to students. I also feel emotional alongside my students when they tell me stories of distress or pain. Self-care is key to me staying in this profession for the long haul. Remember the group of rude, taunting 14-year-old students I had mentioned earlier? To work off my frustrations about them, I took to kickboxing in my first year as a counselor. The vigorous moves really helped me to shake off my pent-up emotions. Over time, I found other ways which were more suited to my temperament to regulate myself. Nowadays, I jog, do gardening, journaling, pray and talk with my husband as means to care for myself after a hard day's work. You may also wonder, have I lost a student to suicide, to illness, to death? Yes, I have. You may be curious how a counselor feels when greeted with death, because most of the time when you see us debriefing the affected students, we are just stoic in our expressions. Encountering death is part and parcel of being a counselor, I guess. Does it affect me? Of course it does. I'm also human with feelings, emotions, and thoughts. I too feel the pain, the hurt, and the loss, like any of you who may have lost a friend suddenly. To manage my emotions, I would engage in my self-care activities. Sometimes the fear of death can drive me into hypervigilance. I remember this one time when I was attending to a student who was suicidal, and he had shared with me that he often liked to sit at high places to look far and enjoy the breeze, which helped to clear his thoughts. Gosh, that freaked me out for a whole week as my imagination would keep on going about the worst case scenario. I was so jumpy that week that I kept checking in on him daily. He must have found me really annoying. My faith is also a very important part of my self-care. When all seems bleak in my work, it is my faith that kept me going. God was my strongest support when I felt inadequate, when I felt uncertain, when I felt drained. After each sudden loss of my students' lives, God would comfort me, pick me up again, and keep me going for those who are still alive. The interesting thing about counseling is this. The actual change does not happen in the counseling room, but outside of it. When a student comes in and talks about his or her issues with me, an exchange takes place. I give my inputs, I help the student to explore in greater depth the issues at hand. The real test of what had been discussed in session is what happens after the session when the student steps out of my room and back into his or her world. Some students are nice. They will return to update me on how they have been doing, even after they graduated. I just recently received a text update from an alumnus who did fantastically well in her first year in university to nab an academic award. And she did it by not taking any psychiatric medications. These are my proud moments. It's like they have all blossomed and found their grounding in the world beyond our eye. There are some students who turn up after years of hiatus. Last Christmas, I received a parcel in the mail. It was a gift pack from a student whom I saw and attended to in my early years as a counselor. She's now 30 years old, and I saw her when she was 14. Imagine that. It turned out that she took effort to look for me and find out where I am. Thankfully for her, she found my details linked to RafflesInstitution, and therefore that was where she sent her gifts to. I was really so touched by her efforts to track me down just to send a "How are you?" and "Thank you for helping me" note. I believe she is doing well in life now. Hence, I can never know what my ripple effects are and how far they spread. One can only hope that the 55 minutes exchanges in my counseling room are sufficient to boost my students up for the challenges of life and help them to stand firmly and confidently in their futures, that they may benefit others around them and the next generation too. These are some of the appreciation items that my students have given me over the years. Some of them wrote notes while others left drawings and art pieces. Some made coasters, paper flowers, and an angel, and even a worry doll for me. I treasure each of these a lot as they remind me of the lives I had encountered in my counseling seat. And I do often wonder where and what are they doing now. Some faces and stories I will never forget. Just as I wonder how far my impact goes, I guess my students may also never really know the impact they had had on me, how they have molded my perspective of life, honed my counseling skills, changed me as a person. If you were ever one of my counseling students listening to this, I'd just like to say a big thank you to you for the laughter we had shared, the deep sharing that you entrusted me with, the teachings you had given to me, the tears you had shed in my room, the vulnerability you had shown to me. You had contributed to who I am today, and for that, I'm humbly grateful. So I hope now you have greater clarity about what goes on for a counselor when we are engaging with you. 1, the counselor is not all-knowing. We do not have ready answers for your issues. Instead, counseling is a journey that you and I take together, and we collaborate to find the answers to your life issues together. 2, the counselor is also human, subjected to physical and mental strain. We need time out now and then to care for ourselves so that we can better care for you. Exercising self-care is our way of honoring and respecting you, ensuring that we are always present in the counseling room with you and not feeling burnt out or tired. 3rd, the counselor's heart is open and free of charge. While we are paid for our expertise and time, it is our heart for this work that keeps us going. It is our heart that cares for your well-being, and therefore we try our utmost for your best interests. I hope that through my sharing today, I've clarified some of your assumptions about counselors, and that you will be more inclined to step into a counselor's room whenever you need to. Thank you for listening.